This next part, we're going to again look at some visual sources. And one of the painters that, again, you can obviously tell I teach a lot of world history and European history, but you will see some examples from government and some other contents as well. But as we start looking at this, I think no matter what content you're teaching in the social studies, what we're talking about in these practices are applicable to all. So if you don't see something that resonates, well, I teach U.S. history, or you're not showing any U.S. history examples, I'm just asking that you please kind of think about the practices themselves. You know your content, and to start to examine the practices through your content. So we're going to begin with Napoleon. We'll stick with Napoleon, as painted by Jacques-Louis David. Now, David was a prominent painter of the time, but he also had an interesting history because he painted Napoleon, but he also painted Louis XVI. He also was a part of the Revolution, and he paints a very famous painting, which kind of is his undoing, called The Death of Marat. However, as we look at how he's painting Napoleon, we begin here, and we see Napoleon as this very young, handsome general as they start, as he begins his reign, basically, in about 1801, as then first president or consul of France. And then later on he becomes the emperor, and Jacques-Louis David paints him as emperor. And then, he is exiled and he goes to the island of Elba for a short time, but then he makes his journey back and crosses the Alps to return to France. And this is how David paints that picture. What's interesting about all three of these portraits is they're really large. I mean, they are wall size in the Louvre, and they're enormous. So not only are they large portraits, but we all see Napoleon in this very handsome, elegant, heroic nature, because that's who David was. He knew who he was working for. So at the very heart of who Jacques-Louis David is, he's a propagandist, and that's what he wants us to portray him, to portray Napoleon as. So we want to talk about sourcing, corroboration, and contextualization. So as we get those one-sided stories, as we see through Jacques-Louis David and Napoleon, we want to corroborate with other types of sources, and to do that we need to use multiple texts to construct meanings, so that we aren't just getting what the author of the textbook told us, this is what the answer is. We want to construct our own meaning and use these different sources to do that. As we think about, as social studies educators and teacher educators, there are basically two approaches to how we go about teaching content. What's interesting is I really liked Woodrow Wilson as a president, but his idea of what this narrative and attachment to heritage. Woodrow Wilson example is examination and evidence tends to confuse young people. We just need to give them a textbook and a narrative so that they understand the story. I'm really critical of Wilson's perspective there, but I also have to remember that he may have been a man of the times. So in the very early 1900s, Woodrow Wilson, by the way, was president of Princeton for a time, so he's a smart man. But in the very early 1900s, you have to think about what's happening in the United States during that time. We have a great deal of immigration coming into the country, and a variety of cultural stories taking place. And so there is this real emphasis to create an American narrative of what it means to be American. And if you place his words in that context, not in a 21st century context today, it makes a lot of sense. But I think as social studies educators, we agree with the one on the right, and that is that we want to use authentic inquiry, historical reasoning, and skepticism. We want to use primary and secondary sources to examine and let students construct their own meaning around what that piece of history is about. So as we think about sourcing, I'll just use two extreme examples here. Think Howard Zinn, right? People's History of the United States, a Marxist historian, versus Bill Bennett. So Bill Bennett, most people recognize who Howard Zinn is. He passed away just a few years ago, actually. And then Bill Bennett, who's still alive, he was the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan, and he was a history professor. What's really interesting is that Zinn and Bennett were both professors at the same time at Boston University. So I always speculate what those kind of faculty meetings would have been like, because I bet they were kind of interesting. But both have written books about American history. Bill Bennett, America, the Last Best Hope, and then Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. But if you just examine, just real quick, if you examine just what the dedication pages look like of those two texts. So Howard Zinn, he's written over here, "For my brother Shelley, who wanted to live in a better world," the dedication of his book, Passionate Declarations. But if you look at Bill Bennett's dedication page, to the American soldier, whose fidelity, patriotism, and valor had made this land the last best hope of earth. Just in the dedication pages, you see the very contrasting perspectives that they have about teaching history. When we analyze text with my students and with those who are going to be teacher candidates, we want to do a CAP analysis of text. That is, we want to analyze its context, its audience, its purpose, its point of view. And you see that I asked my students to draw that plus in their notebook, and we're going to use each quadrant to do the analysis as we either examine a primary source or some type of secondary source. So we've got this primary source here, and I selected this one because it's from a very prominent day in American history, the 4th of July. And so as we think about the 4th of July, we always, you have your own context of that. You're probably thinking parades and fireworks and outdoor cookouts. It probably always is pretty pleasant. But as we examine that from Frederick Douglass's perspective in 1852, the rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. And so we can do the CAP analysis. What's the context? What do we know about 1852 in American society? Who is the audience? And we can see, if I could get out of the way, that he's talking to the New England Anti-Slavery Society. And I can also tell you that that is a mostly white group of people in 1852. What's the purpose of the document? Well, clearly it's the 4th of July and people are waxing sentimental, but he wants everybody to pause for a minute and think, this isn't the America that we need it to be. And that's also going to be his point of view. So the purpose and how the document is used, again, we do this CAP analysis. One more primary source, again, with the CAP analysis. Again, we'll take a very important day in U.S. history, the Bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. So it was in 1987, and a Supreme Court justice by the name of Thurgood Marshall said this: "In this bicentennial year, we may not all participate in the festivities with flag-waving fervor. Some may more quietly commemorate the suffering, struggle, and sacrifice that has been triumphed over much of what was wrong with the original document, and observe the anniversary with hopes not realized and promises not fulfilled." That's a really powerful text. So the context, again, where it's the 200th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution, which most people would say is this everlasting great document, but we have a Supreme Court justice who's being quite critical of it, talking about how, it really isn't what it should have been. He says there were errors with the document, and certainly there were. We could talk about the purpose of Thurgood Marshall speaking out on the 200th anniversary and who the audience might be, and it's very evident if we work with students what his point of view is. I included this slide because I just want to keep reminding teachers that the U.S. Census data is a very good source, and our Census Bureau has gotten better at presenting data that's a lot more friendly. You have this kind of infographic feel to it now, and I teach civics to 9th graders, and they love this place to look at statistical data. It's a great place to do that and to find data that you can use as an inquiry basis to dive into learning. And then also sticking with this idea of teaching civics and government, this is another site that I would encourage people to think about using, and that's called the Living Room Candidate. What's cool about this is that it's an online resource where you can look at basically all the campaign commercials that were ever happened, since the 1950s forward, and they've gotten really good at this source about letting you kind of work your way through like a database and select the types of sources that you want. It's maybe hard to see, but that's the image on the video that you see there, the captured is a Reagan commercial from the 1980s, and it was a scare tactic commercial, and it was called The Bears in the Woods, the bear representing the Soviet Union, and your choice would have been, at that time, Walter Mondale, and he isn't going to keep you safe from the bear in the woods. And it's really fun to have students identify and analyze the campaign propaganda. You go through this exercise with them, I guarantee you they look at all kind of campaign rhetoric very differently in the future, especially if you do the CAP exercise that I talked about. I also like to use secondary sources because, as history teachers, I suppose we spend a lot of time just reading history books, lots of different books that come out. I do. I find them really interesting. And I was reading this book last summer and I came across this text and I just thought, that's so great. I just love it. It's like a riddle. A genius immortalized her. A French king paid a fortune for her. An emperor coveted her. Poets lauded her. Singers crooned of her. Advertisers exploited her. And so I present that to my students to talk about who are they talking about. And eventually they get it, that it is the Mona Lisa. And it's from a text called Mona Lisa, Life Discovered. We've talked about Leonardo da Vinci before, but I don't think I've ever investigated with my students who the woman was in the portrait. And that's what this book is about. And so we pulled some excerpts from that book to discover a little bit about who this woman was in Italy. One last thing, as you're thinking about this part to the presentation, is I encourage you to use unique perspectives of history. This is a book by Tom Standage called The History of the World in 6 Glasses. Tom Standage is an editor at The Economist magazine in London, but he's also an author and writer. He put together this book where he examines world history, an economic look through 6 beverages, how these 6 beverages shaped world history: wine, beer, rum, tea, coffee, and Coca-Cola. So with our students, this is a book that they do read, they really enjoy. It's, like I said, a very different perspective. They've never thought about an economic piece of history. And then we're always looking for ways to be more authentic with how we read the book, we've talked about the book, but how can we be more authentic in our assessment of this text? So one of the things we did was we wrote letters to Tom Standage asking him questions about historiography, about how did you collect this information about this? And I asked students to pick pieces of the text and to write that to him. And he's really generous, and he sends quick emails back to them. So I think that kind of authentic relationship that they create with this is really important as well. Our last section, we're going to talk about corroborating evidence. Using multiple sources and perspective on the same event. We've done a little bit of that throughout the presentation, but I just want to show you some other ways that I think teachers need to make sure that we're doing in the classroom. This is from our 6th grade textbook, well, most people's 6th grade textbook here in Minnesota. So the name of the textbook is Northern Lights, and you have to really be purposeful as you teach this history, because I think the authors of the text have done a great job of including these primary pieces that are kind of in the text, but if we're not very explicit with our students, that can be something that they look over. So this is the same event. The first one on the left. Our course then is plain. The Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. That's the governor of the state addressing the legislature in a special session in 1862. Basically calling for the extermination of a people. And then the one on the right, I have not killed, wounded, or injured a white man or any white persons. I have not participated in the plunder of their property, and yet today I am set apart for execution, and I must die in a few days. My wife and children are dear to me. Let them not grieve for me. This is from our 6th grade history textbook. So in Minnesota, it's Northern Lights, or most districts use Northern Lights. And you have to be really explicit when you're teaching this history with students as we teach Minnesota Studies, because both of these sources are in the text, but if we're just asking students to look over something and really not bring it to their attention, it might be something that they don't really learn from. This is so interesting because when you present these 2 sources, we ask students, okay, what is the truth here? So on the left we have this statement from the governor of the state. Our course then is plain. The Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. Governor Ramsey addressing the legislature in a special session, September 9, 1862. So the governor of the state calling for the extermination of a people. That's something. And then the source on the right. I have not killed, wounded, or injured a white man or any white persons. I have not participated in the plunder of their property, and yet today I am set apart for execution and must die in a few days. My wife and children are dear to me. Let them not grieve for me. Let them remember that the brave should be prepared to meet death, and I will do as becomes a Dakota. So this is written by a man who was writing of his being wrongly accused of the involvement in the Dakota War of 1862. And so we present these very contrasting perspectives, and where is the truth? What is truth where this is concerned? And what's also interesting is our students don't know this, but we as educators should know that we don't have a lot of source material from Dakota or Ojibwe or Anishinaabe peoples because a lot of their language is not written. And so when we get source material like this, we really need to look at it with our students. We're going back to Napoleon again. So I remember we talked about how Jacques-Louis David is a propagandist, and he had painted Napoleon crossing the Alps, and he's got this wind in his hair, this Lippenzahner stallion. I mean, it's just perfect, right? But Paul Delaroche, also a French painter, painted after the fact, 1848, probably a much more accurate depiction of how Napoleon crossed the Alps, and that is by mule, being led by another man, and we see the background is cold and barren, and the Alps have snow cover and everything else. So I asked students, which one's more accurate? The one that was painted during the time, or one that is painted well after the fact, and why? Also, we're talking about, with our teachers, about the document-based question, and so many of our teachers in my district look at a DBQ as something that just happens in AP classes, and I have to keep reminding our teachers that the document-based question is not just an assessment on an AP exam. It is a great exercise to corroborate sources, to understand the complexities of the event and the continuities of change over time. So we really need to, no matter what level our students are at, AP, on level, we need to give them these exercises to let them kind of construct their own meaning. And I pulled just a couple documents. I'm not going to go through a whole DBQ with you, but on the Cold War and Polish solidarity. So this is a poem that was written by Czesław Miłosz, who this was in, I think in 1971, there was a man who was gunned down outside the shipyard. And Miłosz wrote this poem to kind of honor what this man stood for. And he was, basically against this type of communism being employed on the Polish people. But this poem, it's 5 lines, but it's so poignant. You who have wronged a simple man, bursting into laughter at the crime, do not feel safe. The poet remembers. You can slay one, but another is born. The words are written down, the deed, the date. And so with my students, I ask, what kind of does this poem make you feel about this man who wrote it? And they eventually come to the conclusion there's a lot of anger behind this man, and why would he do this? And it helps us to kind of investigate a little further. Sticking with Cold War and this idea of Polish solidarity, again in a DBQ exercise, this source is from the Polish Communist Party. These were instructions that were distributed to school teachers, and the school teachers were expected to read aloud to all of their students in advance of a visit by Pope John Paul II, who was the first Polish Pope, in March of 1979. So Pope John Paul, the Polish miracle, the man that gave Polish people great pride, all the school teachers had to say these words to their students before he came. You should convey to your students that the Pope is our enemy because he celebrates Mass for political dissidents. Due to his uncommon skills and great sense of humor, he is dangerous because he charms everybody, especially journalists. Besides, he goes for cheap gestures in his relations with the crowd. For instance, he puts on a folksy hat, shakes all hands, kisses children, etc. His behavior is modeled on American presidential campaigns. And so for our students today that don't really have this idea of what the Cold War was about, why would a government tell school teachers to say this about the Pope? It really begs a lot of questioning and has them really thinking about this kind of as an inquiry exercise. And it's a lot more interesting than just reading through your textbook that, oh, the Pope visited and that was a big thing in Poland at the time. This gives you that underlying text that brings a lot more vividness to that narrative and that story. Sometimes my colleagues look at me strangely, but I think, especially at high school, we should think about using picture books to read aloud to introduce a unit of study. And this particular book is called The Curious Garden. It's written by Peter Brown, but it's about an event that took place in Manhattan. But as you read the book, innocently enough, you don't really know that if you don't have the background. But it's also a metaphor for teaching, I think, and it's also a metaphor for how we want to interact with our communities. So I use this book with my government students to introduce a unit of study on local government. And we talk, because basically what's happening in this story is this boy finds this abandoned railway, and he goes up there and he sees there are some plants that are kind of surviving, but he wants to help them, and he starts to garden them. The context where this story is set, by the way, is Manhattan and the High Line project that took place in Manhattan Park, and it's beautiful. And then, so we introduced this concept about local government and how we can impact our communities with this picture book. But then I layer it with another piece of text. And there's a TED Talk called, from Robert Hammond, called Building a Park in the Sky. And he basically tells this story. It's one of those 6-minute TED Talks. It's really quick. But he tells that story of, you know, I lived in the neighborhood and I saw this flyer hang on a pole and they're going to tear down the High Line. And I thought, oh, I don't know why they're going to do that. And I'm going to go to the city. I went to my first community meeting. I'd never been to one before, didn't know what to expect. And he goes through this whole process of how he and a partner changed this whole idea of what they were going to do with the High Line and how much value it brought to Manhattan when just hours before it was going to be something they tore down. It's a great way to introduce, as I said, to students local government and what kind of impact they can have on their own communities. And beginning with this, what is the real situation and what is my ideal? What would I love my community to look like? And how can I shape that and be involved as a citizen? So the aims of our presentation today, we'll talk about using multiple and diverse texts, using the practices of sourcing, corroboration, contextualization, the CAP exercises I mentioned, context, audience, purpose, point of view, and using these practices in no matter what you're teaching in the social studies. And I think it's a great way to get students to really engage in literacy practices, because that is something that we really must do as we help them become the citizens of our country. Thank you for your attention today. Again, my name is Todd Beach. I'm a teacher at the University of Minnesota, and there is my contact information. Thank you.